Hi. So, a lot has happened to Commander over the past few weeks. Allow me to recap a bit for the benefit of the people that are watching this in the future. First, Nadu, Dockside Extortionist, Jeweled Lotus, and Mana Crypt got banned. Then, the internet cast wave of vitriol, harassing anybody they could find that was even tangentially involved with the decision. As a result, the Commander Rules Committee disbanded and handed over the reins of the format to Wizards of the Coast. This is obviously not how any of this should have played out, but here we are. As part of the Passing the Torch announcement, Wizards and the Rules Committee teased a new system where decks are grouped into 4 brackets, along with providing guidance and shared language to ease communication. This is a new approach, and I've noticed it's caused a bit of confusion and some questions. I personally think this new system is a great idea, and I would like to use this video to illuminate the design process one might go through to arrive at it, and to explain why it makes a lot more sense than just having a ban list like we used to. First of all, I believe that Commander shouldn't have a simple ban list. Allow me to be clear here. I don't mean that the cards on the current ban list are poorly considered, but instead that the current ban list is a flawed concept and should be abolished altogether. I will at no point during this video talk about any specific cards on the ban list, because even if we assume that the banned cards and the justifications for their bannings were flawless, I would still argue that there shouldn't be a ban list, because to me, a ban list is the fundamentally wrong approach to Commander as a format. I am arguing for a complete abolishment of the current ban list and then for an implementation of a new system that was designed from the ground up for Commander. To make this point, we're going to focus on the intentions for the format as a whole and the problems that come along with those, and then we will see how that has us arrive at the solution that was proposed by the Commander Rules Committee. If you're watching this video, you're familiar with Commander as a format. You understand the gameplay rules of it and its social contracts. You have played a lot of the game and seen how it works out in practice. But there are 2 sides to game design. Not only the experience the players have, but also the experience the developers intended. The ban list is a developer-side tool. We everyday players have no meaningful impact on what is happening with it. To make conceptual adjustments to it, we'll have to look at Commander through the eyes of a developer. Now, Commander may not have had a traditional development team, but there was still a group of people that were in power, and that was the Commander Rules Committee. While they couldn't dictate exactly how we play the game, they still defined the rules by which we do so. How they perceived problems and approached finding solutions depended on their conceptual goals for Commander. For us to properly make sense of Commander as a format and the proposed solution, which from this point on I'll refer to as brackets, we first have to understand the philosophy of the people that defined its rules. Luckily for us, the Commander Rules Committee has a nicely written page on their website specifically about this. This philosophy may change in the future since Wizards of the Coast are now managing Commander, but brackets were already being designed before any of this happened, meaning, while future philosophy adjustments could change our understanding, for now I think it's fair and sensible to analyze the intentions described by the Rules Committee as they were the guiding principles for the design process of brackets. According to the RC, Commander is defined by 3 primary principles. Those are social, creative, and stable. Each of these principles is then defined by specific goals. For social, that means that Commander prioritizes a social atmosphere over competition. The Rules Committee viewed their job as encouraging positive communal experiences and to help players communicate to arrive at a shared set of expectations. For creative, they said that Commander is the format where players can use nearly the entire catalog of Magic's history to build decks rooted in lore, showcasing art, or telling stories. They also explained that it's a space for experimenting with the novel aspects of MTG and for discovering new, exciting ideas. The Rules Committee then aimed to promote an environment where there is space for this range of possibilities while maximizing the available card pool and incorporating new Magic products as they are released. Finally, for stable, they explained that they wanted Commander players to be confident they'll be able to play with their decks for long periods of time. Their role was to only make changes when necessary. They didn't want to ban cards just to shake things up. Their goal was to minimize the effort players had to go through to maintain their decks. I think these are pretty great ideas that are worth pursuing, and I wholeheartedly agree with their intentions. Now, I say that, but it doesn't really matter how I or you feel about this, because we are just trying to understand what the Rules Committee was thinking. And so these principles will be the lens through which we continue on with this video. Now, I am not saying that the developer's intentions define the correct way to play. I very much believe that there is no wrong way for a player to play a game. However they interpret or misinterpret it is inherently valid, as what really matters is the experience they have with it, and that can't be wrong. But when we are making suggestions to the rules of a game, we need to look at it through a developer lens, and the developer lens requires intention. As a player, we can focus on experience, but as a developer, we need to understand what we are actually trying to accomplish. If we don't have clear goals, then we are just throwing things at a wall until something sticks. And while that can work for small-scale projects, it's inappropriate for a game as enormous as Commander and would also go against our design principle of stability. For this next section, I want us to pretend that we are considering implementing a banlist into a hypothetical version of Commander that doesn't have one yet. After all, we're trying to figure out if a banlist is an applicable concept for the pursuit of our goals. So, let's go through this a second time. For the player-to-player social interaction, a banlist can be quite beneficial. It helps them arrive at a more even playing field without even needing to communicate by getting rid of problematic cards. And then it could be used as a frame of reference for cards that aren't desirable for a positive experience. The Rules Committee even stated that this was part of their understanding of a banlist, as they explained that these cards may steer your playgroup to avoid other similar cards. There's a certain logic to this theory, but it doesn't reflect the behavior I would expect. I generally assume that players will try to push boundaries. From my experience, if you tell players, "Don't do this, it will break the game," then they will reply by giving you an exact list of how many pieces they managed to break it into. I wouldn't anticipate that players view cards similar to the ones on the ban list as undesirable, but instead as replacements. If something they want to use isn't allowed, they will choose the next best option. After all, a ban list is also always an implicit whitelist. Everything that isn't disallowed must be fine. So there's some friction here, which we're also going to explore a bit more in a moment, but our main goal is still assisted by a banlist. It does help with communication. It might not be the most direct solution, but it is beneficial. Next, we have creative. And this is where a banlist immediately falls short. If we are trying to maximize the available card pool, then banning cards is the exact opposite of that. Similarly, incorporating new content can also be difficult if players have to worry about that content getting banned. However, the final goal in creative is to promote deck building diversity, and this is where a banlist could arguably help, but it could also be a limiting factor. Some players might be interested in using cards that are ban-worthy from a power level perspective for flavorful reasons. For example, a friend of mine has a Mark Teddin deck, where every card uses artwork made by Mark Teddin, and that includes an Imperial seal. Imperial Seal is an incredibly powerful tutor, but he uses it to fetch up cards like Leviathan. The deck is really quite awful despite playing a handful of CEDH caliber cards. But my friend is aware of that, and it's half the point. The Imperial Seal isn't there to push the power, but just because it fits with the rest of the theme. The major difference between Commander and other Magic formats is, after all, that Commander isn't inherently competitive. This is the baseline laid out at the very beginning, and the most important aspect of the format as a whole. It changes everything, because in a competitive setting, players are incentivized to play with the strongest tools available, which means that if something is too powerful, it homogenizes the format as everybody flocks towards it. Bans can then break up that stale metagame and make space for a wider variety of strategies. At least in theory. There are definitely a bunch of caveats here, and we could make an entire video about this sentence alone. But let's focus, everybody. We can do this. Commander is unique because it doesn't really have a metagame. Players aren't expected to build the most powerful decks, but instead interesting or flavorful ones, as the Rules Committee described in the creative expression section of their philosophy. If there is no meta to break up, then, in theory, limiting the available card pool also limits creativity. So, from a purely theoretical creative point of view, a Banlist fully opposes one of our three major design principles. Now, there's a very good argument to be made that despite Commander not being a competitive game, a Banlist still gets rid of overpowered cards that could become mandatory for the play experience, following the whitelist argument from above, since we are still competing against other players. CEDH, a competitive version of Commander, does exist after all, which is a prime example of players trying to break the rules that were laid out for them. There's always a possibility that the rest of the format could homogenize into that direction. However, I think that history disagrees with this argument. Commander exists specifically to offer an alternative to the competitive nature of default Magic the Gathering. It's always worth keeping in mind that regular Magic the Gathering, Standard, Modern, Legacy, and Commander are two very different games. But regular Magic came first. Many players are choosing Commander specifically to not have to worry about things like a metagame and ranking systems. CEDH players form an exception that we're going to address a bit later. But overall, the player incentives don't align with this concern in a way that feels to me significant enough to justify a ban list. But it is worth mentioning here that a power creeping metagame is a real concern, and any solution we arrive at will need to consider it. Let's tackle the final pillar first. Luckily, it's by far the easiest. Commander is stable. Well, a ban list isn't. That's kind of it. When cards get banned, it's a huge shakeup. Frequent bans are obviously not stable, and rare ones feel hugely impactful just because it doesn't happen that often. While a ban list itself isn't actually that contradictory, the act of banning cards stands in complete opposition to this final pillar. For a ban list to follow this principle, it would have to never change, which feels like it would be too rigid for a ban list to ever be effective. I think it's pretty obvious that Commander has a ban list because it was grandfathered in from traditional Magic the Gathering formats. It was a solution that already existed, making it convenient and something that everybody was already used to. But let's assume for a moment that we just removed the ban list. What would happen? Both social and creative would immediately run into a huge issue, which is power levels. One player might have a deck that is vastly more powerful than the ones of the other players at the table, and that could lead to a negative play experience. This doesn't even have to be a fully designed deck. It could be driven by a handful of overpowered cards. Players might then not be interested in interacting socially, because they were here to play a game, but didn't really get to do anything because they got stomped. And that experience might then pressure them into feeling forced to build a higher power level deck themselves, pushing them away from more flavorful deck building decisions. This is a real problem, And I would argue it's by far the biggest problem that a banlist or alternative solution needs to address. If we wanted to properly fix this issue with a banlist, we would have to first define our upper ceiling, to figure out how we want the game to be played, so we can then enforce that via rules. Then, we would need to ban a huge number of cards, hundreds if not thousands. Anytime something new is found that surpasses our declared power ceiling, we would have to immediately ban it. This would help with the social aspect of the game, as communication would become much easier, almost unnecessary. And arguably, it could help creatively, as a more balanced meta might lead to a wider variety of decks. But we would not be maximizing the card pool. We don't even need to discuss how this wouldn't be a stable format whatsoever, and it assumes there's a metagame, pushing the game into a competitive direction, which is something the Commander is explicitly trying to avoid. Our intentions can never be fully supported by a banlist. We have now contrasted the banlist with the stated design principles of the developers of the game, and I think it's become clear that it's not a great solution. It does a fine job at handling the first principle, but falls flat on its face when dealing with the other two. I know this was a lot of words to say that the Commander banlist doesn't work, but the important point I'm trying to communicate is that it can't work. It's the fundamentally wrong solution to the problems caused by our stated principles. While it can help in certain situations, more often than not it clashes with our design intentions and doesn't actually solve many problems. We now have to ask ourselves if there is a solution that works better for our principles, and for that, we first have to properly define the problems that need solving. Up until this point, we've been working a bit backwards. We had an existing solution and we tried to see if it matched with our intentions. But that's a bit of an awkward way of doing things, isn't it? Instead, we should really start from scratch. So, what is the root problem? Well, at its core, we are dealing with a communication issue. When a pod of players get ready for a round, they have to communicate with each other to arrive at a set of shared expectations. If this communication fails, then we can end up with mismatched games. But if this communication succeeds, then things should be fine. The question we should be asking then is, how do we make sure that this communication succeeds, and what are the problems that are causing it to fail? In my evaluation, there are three major issues that need either consideration or solutions. The biggest is time. I believe it's unreasonable to expect players to spend a large amount of time discussing expectations before playing a game. As with anything, convenience is crucial. If something isn't convenient, people simply won't do it. This doesn't just apply to Magic, this is a general rule to design of any kind. As such, pre-game discussions need to be short. Ideally, they only take about as long as it takes for someone to reach into their backpack and take out a deck box, and then put it back inside and get out a second one. That necessary break of physically unpacking cards is our window of opportunity, but any step we expect beyond that will be increasingly difficult. If we could condense the communication required enough to fit into that narrow time frame, then I think we could very reasonably assume that players would actually do it. This lines up with my personal experience, and I would guess with yours as well. Most players are happy to have a short pre-game discussion, but would rather get started playing than figure out the exact details over the next half hour. The second major issue is language. How one player defines strong will vary widely from how a different player thinks about it. For example, I myself consider Sol Ring to be too powerful for a casual game, but there are many players who would disagree with that. There are a lot of words that we commonly use to describe games and cards that are actually surprisingly difficult to define, like powerful, which I just used, or balanced, and worst of all, fun. I hate using the word fun to describe games. While it might accurately describe your experience as a player, as a developer, it doesn't really tell me anything about it. Tell me how you felt while playing a game. Give me some more emotion than just fun. Anyway, sorry. Interpersonal communication is always difficult. And then we add this additional layer of different interpretations of what the game and the words we use to describe it mean, and it becomes unreasonable to expect players to figure it out within a small window of opportunity. And because of the first issue, we're trying to avoid a large discussion. However, this is a solvable problem. The great thing about language is that it can be created in advance. You are hearing these words right now for the first time, but I didn't come up with them on the spot. This issue can be tackled via preparation, which ideally comes from a single source that uses clear language and offers guidance on interpretation. That way we can aim to have everybody on the same page about what we're trying to say. The difficulty here will be to keep it short and snappy, but I think we can manage. You may notice that this was one of the points suggested by Wizards of the Coast in their article. The first thing they said was that they want to offer additional guidance and shared language. The third and final major issue is desire. Okay, that was a little bit dramatic, wasn't it? Even if we assume the players had taken the time to successfully communicate with each other exactly what they wanted to play, they might still not be able to actually start a game because their ideas conflict too much. This isn't inherently a concern. Magic is a huge game, and it's totally fine for people to have different things they enjoy about it. And it's even fine if there isn't enough overlap that they feel like they can play with each other. But the problem comes in when there isn't enough differentiation between conflicting ideas, because then it might seem there's common ground where there isn't, and that could lead to a negative experience. Let's say, for example, we have an arbitrary scale of 1 to 10 and a table of 4 players. 2 of them want to play at a 3, while the other 2 want to play at an 8. This table can't really work, and everybody realizes this, so there isn't a problem here. The core idea of descriptive differentiation worked. But what if instead they wanted to play at a 4, 5, 6 and a 7 respectively? There's still a large gap between a 4 and a 7, but because they are incrementally closer to each other, the players might agree to play anyways, which could lead to a mismatched and unsatisfactory experience. So, when we are creating our solution, we want to keep the increments of differentiation minimal. While it's tempting to have a large scale with lots of possibilities so that players can define themselves exactly, in practice, we'll need to minimize the scale as much as possible to improve clarity. For a very long time now, Commander players have been using a scale of 1 to 10 to communicate, and it's not been very successful, partially because the differences between 6, 7 and 8 aren't very clear. It's too large and non-specific of a scale. For the proposed bracket system, however, there's only a scale of 4. Unintuitively, a smaller scale like this allows for greater accuracy because it's easier to properly place yourself and choose between the different brackets. So now we have reached what, to me, is the most satisfying part of any design process. We figured out the shape of our solution. To address the communication problem inherent to Commander, based upon our intentions which we defined in principles, we need to come up with something that fits into a 30 to 60-ish second time window, provides pre-prepared language to use, and is incremented, but only as much as absolutely necessary. And that's how we arrive at brackets. The proposed system splits the format into 4 power brackets. Those brackets are then accompanied by guidance, language, and examples of cards that are considered part of that bracket. Grave Titan would be bracket 1, the lowest power level, and Vampiric Tutor would be bracket 4, the highest. If your deck plays Grave Titan, it can be played in any of the brackets, but if it plays Vampiric Tutor, it should only be played in bracket 4. There's of course some leniency expected for flavorful inclusions, but overall this would add some rigidity to the discussion of power levels. This solution fits our shape quite nicely. Quickly discussing which bracket players want to choose would not take longer than 30 seconds, The individual rankings of specific cards act as guidance and language, and there are only 4 of them. Based on our analysis, this has a good chance of addressing many issues with Commander as a format. Our next step should then be to see if this solution introduces any new problems or maintains old ones. And something really helpful for that is searching for comparable systems that have been implemented in other places. Luckily for us, competitive singles Pokémon has been using a very similar system forever. Pokémon is similar to Commander in an opposite kind of way. Where Commander took a competitive game and made it casual, the Pokémon community took a casual game and made it competitive. Well, aside from VGC, but this is about singles, Smogon. VGC, very cool. I like it a lot. Anyways, Pokémon also suffers from major power disparities. For example, Flygon is just weaker than Dragonite. Don't come at me. I'm not debating this point. If there were no restrictions on power level, then it would be very difficult to justify playing Flygon. And so, the Pokémon community created tiers. The baseline tier is called Overused, or OU for short. The philosophy of OU is to just use whatever you think is best. Then, as time passes and the metagame crystallizes, any Pokémon that don't get enough usage in OU fall into the next lower tier, Underused or UU. Importantly, overused Pokémon are not allowed in Underused. If a team contains even a single OU Pokémon, then it can't be played in UU. From here, the same selection process happens in UU. A metagame forms and the best Pokémon get played, while the worst don't. Eventually a cut is made, and the Pokémon that don't see enough usage get dropped into rarely used, and the cycle continues from there. There are many advantages to this system. For example, if a Pokémon is overperforming beyond expectations, it can just rise through the rankings until it eventually finds a home where it's not destroying everybody. Similarly, underperformers can drop in the tiers until they are in a metagame where they are strong enough to see play. But there's a limit to this self-fixing effect. Some Pokémon are just so bad that they don't see play in any tier, and while in theory it's possible to just keep adding new tiers, too many result in low player population counts. And on the other side of the spectrum, some Pokémon are too good for their tier, but not so good that they would naturally rise to the next one. These often get banned from their respective tier and then linger in what's called borderline, where they are not strong enough to see any play in the tier above, but they are too strong for the tier below. Those Pokémon are in the unfortunate position of being unusable for being simultaneously too strong but not strong enough. And some Pokémon are even too good for OU, and when they get banned from there, they are then moved into what's called Ubers. Ubers was supposed to be the home for all of the super broken box art legendaries, and that worked for many years. But eventually some Pokémon were released that dominated Ubers to a degree that made it unfun to play, and so they had to be banned from Ubers, creating anything goes. And I think having to ban Pokémon from the ban list is a little bit odd and not necessarily ideal. Another problem with the tiering system is that it's quite complex. Players have to constantly keep track of which Pokémon are in which tiers. This would only become even more complicated in Magic, since there are significantly more Magic cards than Pokémon. But very importantly, despite its issues, the Pokémon system largely works. Within the tiers, there's a home for most Pokémon. So while the tiers of competitive Pokémon aren't quite the same as the proposed brackets, there is a significant overlap. What we can learn from this is that brackets would fix a lot of the communication issues we had with the traditional ban list, but would also introduce huge learning complexity by essentially creating a cascade of ban lists. It's also not a guaranteed way to ensure that as many cards as possible see play, since they might get stuck in that borderline limbo. So there are some problems here, but they are not insurmountable. After all, we didn't set out to copy the Pokémon system. We had our own problems that we were trying to solve. So let's continue designing, as that's something that Wizards requested. Wizards and the RC were quite clear that the bracket system is still work in progress and that they're open to feedback and suggestions. So, here are my thoughts. I like the bracket system. I was actually working on this video before the bannings even happened, and that style of system was exactly what I was going to suggest. But then everything happened, and so I reworked my video to be more explanation-based. However, the way I would handle it differs a little bit. To me, the most important elements of design are convenience and simplicity. I think it's very important that we hit that 30 to 60 second window of convenience that we established earlier. So any implementation of the bracket system needs to be fully discussable within that time frame. Another way to think about this is, how much expected pre-game study do we consider reasonable? This is where we have to draw a line between Pokémon and Commander. Keep in mind that the games are inverted. Competitive Pokémon is competitive and digital, and Commander is casual and analog. That means we are dealing with different audiences. If you're watching this video, you're likely deeply enfranchised in Magic the Gathering, probably more so than many of the people you would run into at a casual Commander night. For the benefit of those casual players, our explanation of each bracket should be clear and understood within just a few sentences and examples of cards. I think having hard definitions that force cards into brackets would be too complicated and clumsy to fully resonate with a casual audience. I also believe that we should keep CEDH in mind. Regardless of what the format's original intentions were, it has grown into its own and created a somewhat separate game, although still overlapping within the community. In my opinion, Commander is actually a really neat competitive format. I know we just spend a lot of time talking about how it's a casual game, but as Pokémon demonstrated, we can take casual games and make them competitive again. While CEDH isn't my favorite, I run local €50 budget Commander tournaments, and they are exhilarating. I definitely understand why people like CEDH, and I also think that having a competitive branch of Commander is beneficial to the format as a whole, as it creates a mirror to reflect the larger casual side. So, let's make some mistakes and get specific. I think that if I were to write a video like this and then not offer a clear suggestion, then that would be the coward's way out. But please keep in mind that design is an iterative process and that we are still in the early stages. That's exactly why Wizards are asking for feedback. I am going to start by inverting the system Wizards has and make bracket 1 our strongest. That way we can easily count down and even add additional ones later while shifting as few around as possible. Bracket 1 should be CEDH with a ban list that contains only the absolute most problematic cards. That would be unattainable cards like Black Lotus and cards that are so overpowered that even the CEDH community has a consensus on them for being too much. This ban list then applies to the entire format, including the lower brackets. On top of that, we provide written guidance to help clarify what exactly the goals of this bracket are, and this written guidance is really the key of what I'm looking for. For CEDH, that would be something along the lines of CEDH is played with the most powerful commanders and strongest cards. The goal is to win as quickly and efficiently as possible, no matter the strategy. When you play CEDH, expect cutthroat matches where the only goal is to take victory. If your deck plays fast mana, mana-efficient tutors, free spells, and fast-to-execute low-component combo lines, then it's a CEDH deck. And the sample list of cards should be the classic CEDH stables. In my opinion, bracket 1 should be the only bracket with a ban list. That way, there's only one ban list that players have to be aware of. From here, we move on to bracket 2. Bracket 2 is High Power Commander. The guidance we provide is centered around the cards we use. High Power Commander is about playing powerful decks with strong cards. The goal is to play highly interactive games where everybody is constantly deploying game-ending threats. Winning remains your priority. If during deck building you choose efficiency over theme and you have clear and specific win conditions that you're working towards, but you're not playing with a multitude of fast mana, free spells and tutors, then it's a high power deck. The samples we give here are generic, incredibly powerful cards like Rhystic Study, Smothering Tithe, Finale of Devastation, and Glacial Chasm. Bracket 3 then is just Commander, your average game at an average table. The guidance here is by far the most important and difficult part of the entire process. We need to make clear that the main differences between high-power Commander and regular Commander is the quality of cards that are being played and the attitude with which those cards are chosen. It also carries a shift in philosophy, where winning takes a backseat to a more accommodating game experience. I find this one very tricky, and it's definitely going to need more iterations, but here's what I got. Bracket 3 is default Commander. Most games take place within this bracket. Decks here usually have some kind of theme, either focused around specific gameplay mechanics or other flavorful ideas. The cards chosen fit into the theme and might even be amazing within the given theme, but usually aren't just generically great without thematic justification. The goal is for everybody to get to do something. Winning should come secondary to giving all players a chance to play their decks. Matches from this bracket onward should be a kind of collaboration between players rather than a pure competition. This category is definitely the most difficult to describe, and I'm certain he has some corrections he would make to my text. I think the me of the next hour would already feel the same way too, but I need to stop rewriting this eventually. As for cards to place here, that seems almost pointless. This category isn't defined by cards, but by attitude, which is also why I don't think a cascading ban list would be particularly helpful here. No matter how many cards you ban, if someone wants to show up with a turbo combo deck to stomp the table, they will always be able to. It's more important that the intentions of play are clear rather than the specific card selection. But from what I understand, Wizards are already aware of this. Finally, we enter Bracket 4. This is where we place precons and decks of an actively low power level. Guidance should be based around the philosophy of precons, which I can only guess at, but Wizards shouldn't have a problem explaining. I would assume it's something along these lines though. Decks in Bracket 4 focus heavily on their theme. Priorities placed on cards that embrace the theme rather than on cards that work well within it. Decks are light on interaction and often struggle to recover if heavily interrupted. Untouched or only lightly upgraded precons should be considered the stronger type of deck within this bracket. Like in Bracket 3, winning should be more of a side effect to playing a game together. As for card examples, I would just put links to precon lists. I think with a system like this, where there is clear intent communication between players, we would already be very well served. It's less detailed than the current proposed system of limiting cards, but it's also significantly less complex and leaves more room for interpretation, which I actually think is a good thing. I know Rule 0 is often both joke and punchline, but the real problem with Rule 0 has always been that there was absolutely no guidance on how to have a quick and efficient Rule 0 discussion. To me, guidance like I just suggested is all that's needed, at least as a starting point. Complexity can always be added later. Now that I've made the mistake of actually giving a concrete suggestion, let's close out this video. I hope I adequately explained why I think brackets are a much better solution than the old ban list and why I think we should abolish the current ban list entirely and start anew. The ban list has always been a point of conflict within the community, and it will always be that, because Commander has different needs from the game where the ban list originated, and we should be tackling those needs directly. I hope that whoever now handles these decisions is open to taking a different approach rather than just maintaining the old status quo. Commander is a great format. I really like it. But it's also a format that carries a lot of design baggage because it evolved into existence rather than being designed. Maybe right now would be a good opportunity to fix some of those issues. Oh dear, just get ready for the Commander damage video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too long. I hope my arguments made sense. Welcome to this channel. I am Baumi. I make videos on the internet and I'm really excited to be here. Honestly, making this video was a lot of fun, although it didn't really go the way I had originally anticipated. I have to say, I started writing this video long before any of this started happening. And then, you know, it just kind of kept going crazier. And halfway through, I was like, oh no. Oh no. But I'm glad we managed to get it out before the next bombshell drops. I really hope we managed to do that. Anyways, welcome to my channel. As I said, I am Baumi. I have been making content on the internet for a very, very long time, and I am incredibly excited to get started with Magic the Gathering here. I hope you guys are down for it too. It's all gonna be Commander focused. I am very much a Commander player, and we're gonna do a variety of different things, and it's all gonna be done very regularly. So go ahead and subscribe, although at first it might take us a little while because we're still finding our footing in this new environment, but you know, we're gonna get faster, we're gonna get better, so stick around for that. Anyways, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon.